He mocked Karoline Leavitt for sitting in first class. Then the flight attendant dropped a truth bomb that left him speechless. The cabin was packed, every seat in first class taken, every overhead been crammed with designer bags and leather carry-ons. The kind of flight with a scent of cologne and fresh coffee mixed in the air, where men in tailored suits glanced at stock prices on their phones and women flipped through business reports or scrolled absent-mindedly through social media. It was the kind of space where Richard Dunn felt right at home. He sank into his window seat, sighing as he loosened his tie. He'd spent the last 3 days in meetings that had gone nowhere, dealing with clients who wanted miracles on a budget. At least this flight back to Tampa offered a few hours of quiet before he had to return to the grind. Then she arrived. A young woman, mid to late 20s maybe, eased into the seat beside him. She was dressed neatly but casually, a simple black blazer over a white top, no flashy jewelry, no visible designer labels. Her long blonde hair was pinned back in a way that was professional but effortless. She carried nothing but a slim tablet, which she immediately powered on without so much as glancing at him. Richard exhaled sharply. Another trust fund kid playing pretend. He'd seen them before, privileged 20-somethings with rich parents booking first-class flights just because they could. He built his career from the ground up, clawing his way into rooms like this. Meanwhile, kids like her floated in, untouched by struggle, sipping their champagne like it was their birthright. He smirked, shaking his head. "Must be nice," he muttered. She didn't react. Richard turned slightly in his seat, deciding to push a little harder. "Daddy's money, huh? First class for a weekend getaway?" This time, she glanced at him. Not annoyed. Not offended. Just uninterested, like he was background noise. "I'm sorry, what?" she asked, her voice neutral. Richard chuckled under his breath. "It's just funny. People work their whole lives to afford a seat like this. Meanwhile, some of us just get handed it on a silver platter." She held his gaze for a second, then offered the smallest of smiles. Not amused. Not offended. Just polite. Then, without a word, she turned back to her tablet. That annoyed him. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because she wasn't flustered. Maybe because she didn't try to prove herself. People usually did when Richard spoke. People either agreed, got defensive, or tried to justify themselves. But she just didn't care. A flight attendant walked by, offering champagne. Richard took his glass. She declined. "Not a champagne fan?" he asked, feigning casual conversation. "I have work to do," she said simply. He scoffed. "Work? Sure." Again, she ignored him. Richard exhaled, shifting in his seat. The hum of conversation around them barely registered. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails. But every so often, his gaze flicked toward her screen, documents, emails, structured notes. Not the kind of thing you'd expect from a spoiled rich girl planning her next shopping spree. Still, he wasn't convinced. But then something happened that made him pause. "Miss Leavitt, it's an honor to have you on board," a flight attendant said, stopping beside their row. Richard blinked. The woman beside him looked up, smiling warmly. "Thank you, I appreciate it," she replied. The flight attendant hesitated for a second before adding, "I just wanted to say, your last speech, really powerful. A lot of us respect what you're doing." Richard frowned. "Speech? What speech?" But Karoline just nodded in acknowledgement. "That means a lot. Thank you." The attendant moved on, leaving Richard sitting in silence. A nagging feeling crept into his chest. He turned, studying the woman beside him more carefully. Karoline Leavitt. The name tugged at something in his memory, but he couldn't quite place it. He should have recognized it. Should have known immediately. But he didn't. And something about that suddenly made him uncomfortable. But before he could piece it together, the whispers started. And the realization that followed would leave him scrambling for words. Richard shifted in his seat, suddenly feeling the fabric of his blazer a little tighter, the space around him a little smaller. He glanced toward Karoline again, watching as she tapped something on her tablet, completely unfazed by the interaction with the flight attendant. That name, Leavitt, nagged at him. He had heard it before. Somewhere. Maybe in passing. Maybe on the news. But his pride wouldn't let him ask. Instead, he leaned back, arms crossed, exhaling through his nose like a man who had just realized he'd stepped into a conversation he wasn't prepared for. Across the aisle, another passenger, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a well-tailored navy suit, had picked up on the exchange. He peered over the top of his reading glasses, studying Karoline with curiosity before his eyebrows lifted in recognition. "Excuse me, but aren't you Karoline Leavitt?" he asked. Karoline looked up again, offering a small nod. "Yes, I am." The man smiled, clearly impressed. "Well, I'll be damned. You were the White House press secretary, weren't you?" Richard's stomach dropped. Press secretary. He barely had time to process before the man continued. "I followed your career. Your interviews. The way you handled the media. Impressive stuff. And young, too. You've made quite a name for yourself." Karoline responded with a gracious nod. "That's kind of you to say. I just try to do my job well." Richard's mouth had gone dry. He kept his eyes on his phone's screen, pretending to read an email, but the words blurred together. He could feel the shift in the air around them. The passengers nearby had caught wind of the conversation, and now quiet murmurs rippled through first class. "That's Karoline Leavitt. I knew I recognized her. She's brilliant. Handled those press briefings like a pro." Richard felt heat creep up his neck. He had made a snide comment about Daddy's money to a woman who had stood behind a White House podium, fielding some of the toughest questions in politics. He had accused her of privilege when, in reality, she had worked in one of the most high-pressure jobs in the country. And worst of all, she had let him. She hadn't corrected him, hadn't defended herself, hadn't even tried to throw her title in his face. She had just let him. The businessman across the aisle chuckled. "You're probably used to people recognizing you. I imagine it must be exhausting dealing with public perception all the time." Karoline gave a knowing smile. "It has its moments." Richard finally spoke, though his voice was noticeably tighter than before. "So, White House press secretary, huh? I didn't realize." Karoline turned to him, still as unreadable as ever. "You didn't ask. It wasn't a jab. It wasn't even said with malice, just a simple fact. But it landed like a slap." Richard forced a chuckle, trying to recover. "Well, I guess I made a bit of an assumption earlier." She didn't say anything, didn't reassure him, didn't offer him a way out of the embarrassment settling in his chest. She just waited. Richard cleared his throat, shifting again in his seat. "It's just that, you don't exactly look like, I just assumed." Karoline arched an eyebrow, her expression calm but unyielding. "That I didn't belong here?" His stomach twisted. The businessman across the aisle watched with thinly veiled amusement. The murmurs around them had died down, but people were still listening, still watching. The spotlight was on him now, and he felt it pressing against his shoulders, making it hard to sit comfortably. Richard exhaled, forcing himself to chuckle again. No, nothing like that. Just that. I must have had someone else pay for my seat." Karoline finished for him. His breath caught. She had let him walk into this moment completely on his own, giving him every opportunity to stop talking. And now she was standing at the exit, waiting to see how he'd get himself out. She wasn't raising her voice. She wasn't even looking at him with anger. But there was something in her eyes, something firm, something unshakable, that made his stomach churn. For the first time in a long time, Richard Dunn didn't know what to say. But before he could even attempt to save himself, the businessman across the aisle chuckled and said something that made the entire cabin go silent. The businessman across the aisle chuckled, shaking his head slightly as he leaned forward. "You really don't know who you're sitting next to, do you?" Richard's jaw tightened. He hated being the last one in the room to understand something, and now it felt like everyone else had gotten the joke before him. He glanced around, noticing the way other passengers exchanged knowing looks, their quiet whispers like a low hum in the background. Karoline, on the other hand, remained perfectly composed. She offered the businessman a small, polite smile but said nothing, leaving the weight of the moment hanging between them. The businessman took it upon himself to fill in the blanks. Karoline Leavitt wasn't just the White House press secretary. She was the youngest person to ever hold that position. You don't land a job like that because someone hands it to you, you earn it. Richard swallowed hard, shifting in his seat. He could feel the heat creeping up his neck again, the sting of his earlier words now landing with full force. She went toe-to-toe with some of the toughest journalists in the country, the businessman continued, clearly enjoying himself now. Handled some of the most brutal press briefings we've seen in years. And if I remember correctly, she didn't come from money. No silver spoon. No handouts. Just talent, discipline, and a whole lot of hard work. The tension in Richard's chest tightened like a coil. His earlier arrogance had dissolved into something else now. Something uncomfortable. Something that tasted a lot like regret. He turned back to Karoline, who had returned her attention to her tablet as if nothing had happened. No smirk. No look of satisfaction. No need to rub his mistake in his face. Somehow, that made it worse. He cleared his throat. I guess I spoke too soon. Karoline didn't look up. You did. Richard let out a small, awkward laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. I mean, to be fair, you don't really. She finally turned to him then, her expression unreadable. Don't really what? He hesitated. The sentence had started before his brain had the chance to catch up, and now he was trapped mid-thought with no graceful way out. Don't really look like someone important? Don't really seem like you belong here. The words hung in his throat, refusing to form. Karoline let the silence stretch just long enough to make him squirm before offering him an exit. People assume a lot of things about me. I've learned not to take it personally. Richard exhaled, relieved at the out she had given him. But there was no mistaking the meaning behind her words. She had every reason to put him in his place. Every reason to humiliate him in front of these people. To drag him the way he had judged her without a second thought. But she hadn't. She had let him walk himself into this moment. Had let him feel the full weight of his own ignorance. And then, without malice, without theatrics, she had simply moved on. And for some reason, that made him feel even smaller. The businessman across the aisle chuckled again, shaking his head. Done. It takes a special kind of arrogance to assume you know a person just by looking at them. Richard bristled slightly. I get it, okay? I misjudged her. The businessman smirked. Oh, you did more than that. You judged. Dismissed. And then doubled down. More murmurs rippled through the cabin. People were invested now, waiting to see how this all played out. Richard ran a hand down his face, exhaling slowly. This was a disaster. Karoline, however, remained as steady as ever. She glanced up at the businessman and offered a small nod. I appreciate the support, but I don't need anyone to defend me. The businessman smiled, nodding in return. Didn't think you did. Richard exhaled again, willing the conversation to die down. He needed to move past this. He needed to reclaim some sense of dignity. So he tried again. Look, Ms. Leavitt, I was out of line. I shouldn't have assumed anything about you. Karoline studied him for a moment, her gaze steady, assessing. Then finally she gave a small nod. I appreciate the apology. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't cruel either. Just matter of fact. Just enough to let him know she had heard him, but not enough to erase the weight of his mistake. And Richard Dunn, for the first time in a long time, had nothing else to say. But before the conversation could truly settle, the flight attendant returned, this time with a subtle but unmistakable shift in attitude toward Richard. The flight attendant returned, her smile professional but noticeably cooler than before. She paused at their row, glancing between Richard and Karoline as if trying to decide how much she wanted to engage. Mr. Dunn, would you like another drink? She asked, her tone neutral. Richard hesitated. Before all of this, he would have answered without a second thought. But now he could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the cabin, waiting for his next move. No, I'm good. He cleared his throat. Thanks. The flight attendant nodded, then turned to Karoline, and this time her smile was genuine. Ms. Leavitt, can I get you anything? Karoline gave a small, polite shake of her head. I'm fine, but thank you. The subtle difference in their treatment wasn't lost on Richard. Before, he had felt like the unspoken leader of their row, the kind of man people deferred to. Now that dynamic had shifted, and he wasn't used to being on the other side of it. The businessman across the aisle smirked behind his reading glasses, clearly enjoying the show. Richard exhaled, glancing at his watch. They still had a little over an hour left in the flight. An hour trapped in his own embarrassment, surrounded by people who had seen him misjudge someone in real time. The silence between him and Karoline stretched, but this time, it wasn't comfortable. He could feel it pressing against him, making the space between them seem smaller, the air heavier. He glanced at her tablet again, the documents, the structured notes. She wasn't just some idle traveler killing time. She was working, preparing, doing something that mattered. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. You ever get tired of it? He asked, his voice quieter than before. Karoline looked up, her expression unreadable. Tired of what? He gestured vaguely. People assuming things about you. Judging you before they even know who you are. She considered this for a moment, then leaned back in her seat. It used to bother me when I was younger. I felt like I had to prove myself every time I walked into a room. But then I realized. She paused, her gaze shifting toward the window for a brief second before returning to him. The people who underestimate me, they don't get to decide what I'm worth. Her words settled in his chest like a weight. Richard had built his career on perception, on reading people, making quick judgments, deciding who was worth his time and who wasn't. He had always prided himself on his ability to spot value in an instant. And yet here he was, having completely misjudged the most accomplished person in the room. "Must be nice," he muttered, echoing his own words from earlier. But this time, there was no sarcasm in his tone. Karoline tilted her head slightly. "What must be nice?" He let out a short breath, shaking his head. "To be that sure of yourself." A small smile touched the corner of her lips, but there was no gloating in it, just understanding. "It takes time." Richard looked away, staring at the seat in front of him. The businessman across the aisle had gone back to his magazine, but Richard knew he was still listening. The entire cabin had taken on that quiet, loaded energy that came when something unspoken had been settled. He wasn't going to win this one. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to. The flight attendant passed by again, and this time, Richard caught the way she glanced at him. Just briefly, just enough to let him know that whatever impression he had walked onto this plane with was long gone. But before the flight could land, one last exchange between Richard and Karoline would drive the lesson home. The hum of the cabin had settled into a steady rhythm. Passengers had returned to their books, their screens, their conversations. But Richard could still feel the weight of what had happened. The shift in perception, the realization that he had been the fool in this situation. Karoline had returned to her work, her fingers tapping steadily on her tablet. She hadn't gloated, hadn't thrown his words back at him, hadn't even bothered to rub it in. That, more than anything, made it impossible for him to shake off the discomfort sitting heavy in his chest. He ran a hand over his face, exhaling. "You know," he hesitated, glancing at her. "I wasn't always like this." Karoline looked up, one eyebrow slightly raised. "Like what?" He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "The guy who assumes things. Who makes snap judgments." He sighed. "Somewhere along the way, I just stopped giving people the benefit of the doubt." Karoline studied him for a moment, then set her tablet down. "And why do you think that is?" Richard hesitated. It was a question he hadn't asked himself in a long time. He'd always chalked it up to experience, to knowing the game, to not wasting time on people who didn't deserve it. But sitting next to Karoline, he wasn't so sure anymore. "Maybe it's easier," he admitted. "Easier to put people in boxes, to assume you already know their story, rather than take the time to actually find out." Karoline nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And what happens when you're wrong?" Richard exhaled. "Apparently, you end up sitting in first class looking like an idiot." Karoline let out a soft laugh, not mocking, just amused. "Well, at least you're self-aware." Richard smirked, shaking his head. "That's one way to put it." He leaned back in his seat, staring at the ceiling for a moment. "You know, I've spent my whole life thinking I could read people. That I could tell who was worth my time and who wasn't." He glanced at her. "I was wrong about you." Karoline tilted her head slightly. "And how many other people do you think you've been wrong about?" The question landed hard. Richard opened his mouth, then shut it again. He had no answer. Or maybe he had too many. Karoline didn't press him. She simply picked up her tablet again, giving him space to sit with his thoughts. The flight attendant returned, this time with landing instructions. Richard barely heard her. His mind was elsewhere, sifting through moments he had long buried, interactions he had dismissed, opportunities he had let pass because of assumptions he never thought to question. The wheels touched down smoothly, the slight jolt pulling him back to the present as passengers stood and stretched, gathering their bags. Richard hesitated. He glanced at Karoline, then exhaled. "For what it's worth, I really am sorry." Karoline met his gaze, and for the first time, her expression softened just a little. "I know." She stood, grabbing her carry-on. Richard did the same, stepping aside as she moved into the aisle. He watched as the businessman from across the aisle gave her a respectful nod, as the flight attendant smiled warmly and thanked her again, as other passengers subtly glanced her way, recognizing who she was. Richard had spent the entire flight thinking he was the most important person in his row. He had been wrong about that too. And as he walked off the plane, he realized that maybe, just maybe, it was time to start seeing people for who they really were instead of who he assumed them to be. The terminal was busy, passengers weaving through the crowds, rolling suitcases clattering over polished floors. Richard walked at a slower pace than usual, his mind still turning over the events of the flight. Karoline was already ahead, her steps purposeful, focused, like someone who knew exactly where she was going, both in the airport and in life. Richard considered walking the other way, letting the moment pass, but something held him there. Just before she reached the exit, he called out, "Leavitt." She stopped, turned, waiting. Not impatient, not irritated. Just waiting. Richard hesitated, then walked up to her. "Look, I know we already did the whole apology thing, but I meant it." He exhaled. "I was wrong. And not just about you, about a lot of things." Karoline studied him for a second, then nodded. "I believe you." Richard huffed out a small laugh. "I don't even know why I said it in the first place. That daddy's money line." He shook his head. "It was like instinct. The moment I saw you, my brain filled in the blanks, and I just went with it." Karoline crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. "And now," he let out a breath, glancing around before meeting her eyes again. "Now, I think I need to start asking better questions before I fill in the blanks." A small smile touched her lips. "That's a good place to start." She turned toward the exit, but Richard called out again. "Hey, can I ask you one more thing?" She glanced back. "Go for it. You ever misjudge people?" Karoline thought about that for a second, then nodded. "Of course. Everyone does. And when that happens, what do you do?" She gave him a knowing look. "I try to be better next time." With that, she walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Richard stood there for a moment, then exhaled, adjusting the strap of his bag over his shoulder. He had spent years convincing himself that he knew how the world worked, that he could take one look at someone and know their story. But today had proven otherwise. Maybe he didn't know as much as he thought. Maybe he had a lot more to learn. And maybe, just maybe, this was the start of seeing things differently. Because at the end of the day, the real lesson wasn't about Karoline Leavitt. It was about all the people he had misjudged before her. If you've ever found yourself making quick judgments about someone, ask yourself, how much of that is actually true? How often do we assume we know someone's story without ever hearing it? Maybe it's time to slow down and listen. You never know who you're sitting next to.